Morning, everyone. There's a simple truth that's echoed all the way through everything that we've heard from all who've shared this morning. And that is that Jesus said, I have come that you should have life, and life in all its fullness. And sometimes we are called by the Lord to grow into that life by discipleship, by learning, developing. And sometimes we are freed and released into that life by his goodness and grace. And that's basically what we're going to explore this morning. I'm going to read to you from Mark's Gospel. It's Mark chapter 4. And I'm starting to read from verse 35. Mark 4:35. On that day, when evening had come, he, Jesus, said to them, let's go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke. He rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. Crying out with a loud voice, he said, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I ask you, by God, do not torment me. For Jesus was saying to him, Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, What is your name? He, the demons, replied, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, Send us to the pigs, let us enter them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus didn't let him come, but said to him, Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the 10 cities how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. So, here we are at the tail end of chapter 4. We reach a turning point in Mark's gospel as we move from the storytelling teaching Jesus used to unpack the ways and means of God's kingdom and into that full-blown lived experience of being with Jesus and journeying with him beyond that local little world of Capernaum, which everyone knew and felt safe in, where Jesus had made his home, and into this wider world of Israel, with its mixed economy of life experience, of beliefs and faith and views of the world and the way it works and the way things should be. Like our own world, it was a complicated place. Now at the heart of it, though, was an unstoppable, unique truth, which for those who weren't just listening, but were actually hearing and getting and understanding what Jesus was telling them, it was life-changing good news. It transformed everything. It changed lives and it made them whole. But it begins with a storm. So a question for you. Anybody heard of a weather forecaster called Michael Fish? Well, for those who don't know, you can check it out. There's a clip on YouTube I discover. But yes, he was a weather forecaster who back in the late 1980s famously or infamously came on TV and he reassured everyone here in this country that no matter what they'd heard, there was no hurricane heading our way. The weather was at best going to be wet, breezy, and really rather dreezy. It was October. But I wasn't here. I was living in Denmark at the time, so I knew nothing of this. And I'd planned a last-minute trip home as a surprise for my mum, who was coming up to her birthday. It wasn't her that got the surprise. The only ferry I could get was a booking from a place called Hitsalts. It's right in the far north of Denmark. It's about as far away from Sheerness, which is where we were sailing to, while still being in Denmark. The ferry terminal in Hitsalts is essentially just a car park and some place to park a really big ferry. That's it. So while we were there waiting to board, we were all out of our cars and we were chatting and catching up, and someone had a radio on. And the news came on, we listened to the news, and then there was a weather forecast. And the weather forecast said there was going to be a running tide. So we had a bit of a discussion. What was a running tide? Why was the hurry? Where was it going? We really rather hoped it was going in our way. Anyway, a few hours into the sailing, we discovered the tide hadn't made its mind up which way it was going, but it was warming up nicely, jogging on the spot. I had a really lovely cabin, right at the top of the ferry, windows all the way through. I was spoiling myself. I spent most of the night in the bathroom, which was also very nice. It's the most scary journey I have ever made in my life. Really, late into the evening, I went for a walk, staggering around the ship. There was absolutely nobody there. The bar was actually full. But against all the doors, there were guards to stop people going out. And I walked past one of them and I said, "No one's going to go out there." He said, "The last idiot's not dead yet." Next morning, coming through passport control, I could see a copy of the Sun newspaper on the desk. It said, "Sevenoaks in Kent is a one-oak town." I've never forgot it. Now, I got onto that ferry, not knowing anything about the sea, not able to sail. I was entrusting myself to the care of others. Some of those traveling with Jesus in the story that we've just heard were experienced fishermen. It was their boat. They knew those waters well. The Sea of Galilee lies well below sea level. It's surrounded by hills and mountains. Windstorms were common, and especially between late afternoon and nightfall. These disciples would have known all of this, but they still set sail because Jesus said, let's go over to the other side. He was the only reason they were in that boat and out on those waters. When the storm came up, the disciples will have used all their skills and experience, all their resources that they could possibly muster, all their wisdom and insight to manage the boat in the storm, and they kept going. But it looks like it wasn't enough, and the boat was being swamped. Unlike the boat I was on, it didn't have a lid. Jesus was asleep in the stern. What they were thinking when they woke him, you can't really see from the scripture, but from what they say, it seems that they were just looking for all hands on deck and another pair of hands to just empty the water. What they weren't expecting was what Jesus did. He awakes. He gives the wind a rebuke or a serious telling off for causing the trouble in the first place. And he speaks peace to the waves who were clearly being antagonized by the wind. It's a very relational way of looking at creation. Jesus sorts out the storm, but then he starts to sort out the disciples. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith yet? The thing is, the disciples, like all of us, we're all just learners. We never graduate in this particular path of life. It was a big lesson. Sure, they'd seen people healed by Jesus. They'd seen demons cast out by Jesus. But there is only one who commands creation. And they discover that here he was, in a boat with them, on a sea in Galilee. The storms we mostly face in life, they don't involve wind and waves. They can still be really scary places. When we find ourselves in these things, but the thing is, we will face storms and squalls in life, because the world we live in and the life that we live is fractious, it's unpredictable. And frankly, the truth is that negotiating life as a human is an imperfect science. Sometimes we find ourselves in choppy waters because, like those disciples, we are following Jesus' lead. Jesus put them on the water, though, because he had somewhere new to be, and they were with him. And sometimes we will find ourselves in choppy waters, uncharted waters, for no other reason that we're with Jesus, and that's where he has taken us, because he has a purpose for the journey. Clearly wasn't on Jesus' mind that an unruly lake might stop him. He slept in peace. As I said, the disciples will have tried all their skills and experience to keep the boat and those on board safe. But what got out of control for them in truth isn't the wind and the waves, it was their fear. They turned to Jesus only when they'd run out of all their abilities. All their skills had come to nothing, and they thought they were going to lose the boat, and their fear was at its highest point. You ever tried that one? I think we all have. I don't believe none of us haven't. What they should have done, what we should always do, is wake Jesus early and check if he still thought the journey was a really good idea or whether there may be other plans. In our Connect group a couple of weeks ago, we were chatting through about worry. Everyone worries about something, even when there's nothing to worry about. Worry is just a seepage of fear into everyday life. It's a trickle. But its origins lie in fear and uncertainty and insecurity. Full-blown fear is worry on steroids. Mark Twain, the American author, towards the end of his life said, "I've known many troubles, but most of them never happened. And sometimes they do, though." Back in early 2020, so for those who don't know, up until recently I was a healthcare chaplain. I was head of chaplaincy and spiritual care at St. George's, one of the big London hospitals. And I was working at St. George's back in 2020. I had colleagues who were Italian and Spanish. Now, I don't speak Italian, I don't speak Spanish, but they would share with me and others and each other video clips taken on the intensive care units in Italy and in Spain as they were going through the height of that COVID pandemic back then. It was scary. It was scary. We knew that we were next. We were set up, we were ready to go. We were trained, and we were just waiting. On the 19th of March, earlier that week, I'd come home for annual leave because it was Jessica, my wife's, birthday. But it was already ramping up. So I came home on the Thursday evening. I was home on Friday, but the phone never stopped. And I went back on Saturday the 19th. We put into place everything that needed to be done for our spiritual care facilities. And then myself and my Roman Catholic colleague Mark were just sat in the office doing bits and pieces. And Mark's pager went off. And he was called to one of the first really serious ITUs that was already full. About 10 minutes or so later, give or take, my pager went off, called to the same place to a different patient. So we got changed and we went together. Back then, these places were fairly well barricaded off. There were helpful signs saying, "Keep out," "No admittance," "Infectious disease," "No unauthorized personnel." There was just a narrow gap to get through. We walked up to it, looking at this. Mark says to me, "After you." I says to him, "No, after you." He turns to me, he says, "But you're the boss." I said, "Yeah, that's why you're going first." In that snapshot of our relationship is how we did a pandemic. Friendship, mutual respect and support. We watched out for each other, we watched over each other, and we had a keen sense of humor as well. There was a purpose to Jesus' ministry. There is a purpose to Jesus' involvement in all of our lives. And we knew who we were. We knew why we were there. We knew what we were for. And we also knew that Jesus was with us. At times his presence was almost physical. You could nearly touch him. But we had to face the fact that we were scared. And all fears have got to be faced at a personal level. No one else can live out or through our fears. But we don't have to do it by ourselves. We don't have to do it alone. who you have with you in that experience makes all the difference. It can transform it. If your life is troubled, you're struggling, if the waters are choppy, wake Jesus early. Invite him along for the journey. Ask him if it's a good idea to make the journey. When they do finally reach the far side of the lake, it's to a part of Israel that has a big Gentile population, a non-Israeli population, non-Jewish. And they come face to face with a man who's not just got one unclean spirit, but a whole legion of the things taking up space in his life. A legion in the Roman army was about 6,000 soldiers, so you could say that there was quite a crowd in this get-together. They'd invaded this poor man's life, and they were destroying him, because that's what these influences do. He and his life were out of control. He was being destroyed both physically, psychologically, and socially. He was in terrible torment. And that's the thing, it's not just choppy waters, what goes on inside us too can come to a boil. And it's hugely destructive. Personally, I feel sorry for the pigs. I like pigs. Well, so did they, and that was part of the issue. When Jesus gives permission for these pigs, these spirits, to leave the man and enter the pigs, their lives are destroyed. God's creation is destroyed by their presence and influence, as is the livelihood of all those who own them, because they were being farmed for food. Demons and their influences are always destructive. And they can be there in our lives in such subtle ways that you never even consider that there's an influence going on that might just be destructive. But the dignity of this man's humanity is completely restored. He's able to sit quietly for the first time in whoever knows how long. He's clothed. They have clothed him. They've clothed his nakedness, and he's in his right mind. The source of his torment is gone. Now, the thing to pay attention to for us, as much as anything, is that there's no such thing as a vacuum in creation. It's a false thing. If you empty a space out in your life, something else will fill it. For this man here, what filled that now emptied space was the presence of Jesus. He had peace and new life. And he was filled with joy. And that source of one-time chaos was now filled with peace. In Luke 11:24, Jesus tells the story of an impure spirit that was cast out and later returns to see what's living in its old home now. They discover it's all nice and tidy, but it's still empty. So they move back in and invite a few friends to join them. And the bottom line is that the state of that person's life is far worse than it was at the beginning, quite simply because they left the space empty. It's not a good outcome. You know, anybody who struggles to cast things out of their lives that we feel are unhealthy or unhelpful or even destructive will know what a huge struggle it is. Anyone who's fought addictions, whatever they are, drugs, alcohol, sex, shopping. These are all things. If we don't fill up that emptied space with something new, something more attractive, something that fills our lives with joy and hope and even pleasure, they'll just come back. They'll find their way back because that's their natural home. Nothing else is living there, and it belongs to them by habit and routine. It's just the way it works. It's also true in this busy world of ours, where we find, as Dave was saying, our sense of identity and self-worth in work, in duty, in responsibility, that we take on more and more because it's attractive, because that's where we find our meaning and purpose in life. But the more and more we allow these other outside influences to demand things of us, these things end up running our lives. Our lives are no longer our own. They're run by other influences. They control us. They control our lives. And they control what's important to us. And it's easy for those things to be lost in the mayhem and chaos of what our lives can become in these times. Life is always worth just a really simple, regular review. Who am I? I'm a child of God, infinitely precious, and there's nothing that I can do to improve that picture. Why am I doing these things? Who gains? But also, who loses? And finally, as we approach the end of the passage, we're back to fear. Jesus transformed the disciples' fear into a sense of awe and wonder. Their experience boosted their confidence. It fueled their faith and trust in him. And they continued to grow as they learned and shared in that life with him. For the community in Gerasenes, who knew this poor man well and knew that there was no restraint in their power to control him, seeing their animals destroyed as an outcome of his healing, provoked fear and suspicion. They asked Jesus to leave. And being the gentleman he is, he left. If someone's sense of God is fueled by fear of who he may be for them, what was it we sang earlier? I've heard 1,000 stories of who people think God is. If their view of God is fueled by fear, fear will always drive them away from him. It will never attract them to him. Years ago, when I was in ministry in Doncaster, a member of the congregation's mum passed away, and I looked after the family, and I looked after her dad. He was an academic. He was now well into retirement, but he'd been an academic, he was a socialist, and he was an atheist. He was very lost in his grief. And I supported him, visiting every week or so. And it was on the run-up to Christmas. And I said to him one day when I'd been spending time with him, I said, look, the family's coming to our carol service. I said, you don't have to do anything. I said, the service runs itself. I said, if you come late, just before it starts, the lights will already be going down because the service is pure candlelight. And I said, you can sit there quietly and just soak in the atmosphere. And he said to me, will they let me in? Will they let me in? We know Jesus. He's unconditionally loving, and he's gracious, he's kind, and he's gentle towards us. He knows who we are, and he loves us for who we are. But for those who don't yet know him, but do know themselves, with all that sense of brokenness and failings, getting close to God can be a really scary thought. We need to pay attention to who we are for others, always. We need to bear witness to that love and compassion of who Jesus is in how we manage ourselves and our relationships with others. We need to do that to keep our witness truthful, as well as each other and others who come to join us, whole and safe. We need it to be a place of healing. So, storms of all shapes and sizes are always a possibility in life. The thing is not just to have Jesus in the boat to make sure he's helping you also plot the course. Be clear with yourself who you are, what you stand for, what you're about, and what the Lord is doing with you and where you are with him. All fears have got to be faced personally, but you don't have to do it alone. Make that choice to invite Jesus in early. Don't try and sort everything out by yourselves. It's not something we're called to do. Be thoughtful about what influences you let into your life, even those that at first may appear attractive. Doesn't everything begin that way? Letting the wrong things into our lives can be very costly. Casting them out again is very challenging. But if you remember one thing from anything I've said this morning, there's only one thing I want you to hear. The wind and the waves, they still know his name. Amen.